Perfect. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Brilliant, brilliant. I was just thinking when you were giving the introduction there, Jens, I just love this kind of new world where you can say, hi, Jens here from Stockholm and Hong Kong. You're in two places at once. It's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And very apt for the event we're running, obviously, growing internationally and investing internationally. So I'll just give a quick kind of summary to the event, and then intro myself, and then Atin and Amanda, and then we'll dive in. But I'm super excited to take part in this, and I really hope that this is valuable for everyone, and I'm sure we'll bring out some really interesting. We'll draw out the interesting insights and experience that Amanda and Atin have accrued over their wonderful careers. So obviously, quick introduction. Obviously, with a rapidly shrinking world, you know, we're all interconnected. We're probably across maybe 10 or 15 countries, I would guess, just on the attendees on the in this event already so far. With that, obviously, you could assume that the differences between us are shrinking, and that obviously it's easier to have sort of more perfect information across the world. But I think, you know, we'd all argue against that in some areas as well, where there's still some broad fundamental differences between us, and that actually the markets that we predominantly operate in are, you know, pretty different actually. Some are slightly ahead, some are slightly behind, and, you know, this new world that we're working in is, you know, especially the very current new world is actually only about 4 or 5 months old. So I think, you know, diving into how things look now versus in the past, and how things will change in the future is a very, very apt topic to focus on. So we'll sort of start on the sort of macro level, and then we'll kind of dig in over time to the micro level, and ask the questions that a lot of you will really care about, as well as I know a lot of you are founders and operate in startups or will soon. So we'll cover sort of very tangible tactical questions as well towards the end. Brilliant. So quick introduction to myself. I'll make it short because I have not done as much cool stuff as either Atin or Amanda. But Jens touched on Startup Grind briefly there. Obviously, this is a co-run event with Startup Grind. We obviously run a large global community. My role is VP of the startup programs here at Startup Grind. We run a huge amount of different campaigns and programs to support companies and investors and all the other nodes of the startup ecosystem here at Startup Grind. And so my interest in this topic and these questions and working with people like Atin and Amanda is really because, you know, I'm interested in taking what is a Silicon Valley company and really opening it up across the world and providing as many opportunities as I possibly can to people from ecosystems, irrespective of where they're from. So I'd love to answer any questions afterwards about program and how we run it as well. Anyway, I'm based in London, and I'm very, very happy to be involved in this. Atin Batra is the founder and general partner at 27 Ventures, which is a VC firm investing in early stage, predominantly edtech and future of work startups across the world. The company actually looks for entrepreneurs with an overwhelming drive to build a business that not only focuses on creating shareholder value, but also leaving a positive impact. And I know that that's something that Amanda is very interested in as well. And I'm sure we'll dive into the questions around impact investing a little bit later on. Atin, you've I think invested alongside a number of well-known companies, obviously BMW, I think you mentioned to me, Google, Mark Cuban's family office, and have a variety of experience across different continents as well. So I'd love to kind of hear your perspective, having worked directly in a variety of different continents now that I know that you actually sit in Asia now. Just before I go on to Amanda, I'd love to, you mentioned something fun before, outside of work that you focus on, and I just want to ask you to bring that out because it's a niche skill and interest. Do you want to just tell that story quickly to the attendees?
Sure. So the thing that I do out of work and that I spend most of my time in is I'm an ultramarathon trail runner. So that means is I usually run races that are 50K, 100K in distance. It usually takes me somewhere between 20 and 30 hours to run them. and they're always in the mountains. And the amazing thing is that Hong Kong actually is the perfect place for this. Not a lot of people know, but there's just some amazing mountain trails here in Hong Kong, and I feel so lucky to be based here. So that's what I do outside of work.
And some fantastic views when you're running up in those hills as well, I guess, over the city. And a
Yes.
very good analogy for the startup world as well, running an ultramarathon up hills and down hills, and occasionally getting a great view, but then, you might fall and
hopefully back up again.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. And just to move on to you quickly, Amanda, and then we'll kick off. You've been an advisor for the founder of Next Chapter Ventures for a while, and I think recently you've joined their newest offering, Raise, as the strategy lead, right? And I've got here that you said your mission is simple: help women get funded faster. I can imagine that although it's a simple mission to want to drive towards, because obviously highly impactful and relevant, I can't imagine that achieving it is super simple, very complicated, yet very impactful goal. So I love that. Obviously, you're an active community builder as well, helping to develop training and run podcasts and just educate people about how to better support women across the world, which is a wonderful goal to have and a wonderful way to operate. And obviously your main investment experience is also as an impact investor. So I'd love to bring that in a bit later on. And your interesting story is slightly different, but also relevant to the attendees. Do you want to share some about that before we kick off?
Sure. I always like to say that I've kind of been on all sides of the table in the startup and investment world. So I did start off working for very, very early stage startup in London in 2005. We were in the attic of our accountant's office, and you'd go to parties and say, "Oh, I work for a startup," and people had no idea what that even was. Now, you can't walk through London without falling over a co-working space or something in Silicon Roundabout, some reference there. But back in the day, it was very, very new, very against the British sensibility, very risky.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both for joining. I'm very excited to dive in. So let's kick off then. So I think just to set some context quickly, obviously, the history of the last 40 or 50 years of startup tech, or whatever you want to call it, has been very focused on Silicon Valley. And I think, a lot of us on this call are, predominantly interested in everything outside of Silicon Valley as well. So can we just start by, maybe Atin, you could dive into just telling me a little bit about what the kind of main differences have been over time. If you were to start a company 10 years ago in Silicon Valley versus now, what would you say are the main differences?
Did you mean within Silicon Valley, or just generally starting a company 10 years ago and today?
So yeah, exactly. The difference between 10 or 20 years ago starting a company in Silicon Valley versus now.
Okay, so specifically within Silicon Valley, I suppose there's really no difference from 10 years ago, except for maybe the fact that you've got larger companies that are churning out just some amazing talent. And that's probably the biggest advantage, is the fact that you've now got all of these operators that have, 5, 7, 10 years of experience working at an Uber or an Airbnb, where they've seen the company grow from, 0 customers to now having millions of customers. And that kind of, I call it institutional knowledge. That kind of institutional knowledge is so rare to come by, because some of these companies really are once in a generation almost, right? How many times will you see an Uber being built, really, to be honest? So to have an operator with that kind of experience come back out, leave Uber, come back into the ecosystem, and either found a company or join another company as an operator, is just an amazing advantage for that company, I'd say. So that is, in my mind, the biggest difference from 10 years ago in Silicon Valley to now. I would say that is also true, not just of Silicon Valley, but actually the startup ecosystem across the world.
Okay.
One of the things that we've seen in the last 10 years is, with no prejudice, or I'm not trying to pick a particular ethnicity here, but there are so many Chinese operators who've worked for these amazing companies and have come back to China and have started their own companies in China, and they've become really big because, again, they brought back that best practice, that institutional knowledge with them. Same thing, for example, happened in India, where I'm from. We had all of these amazing startups that are now being founded by engineers who had experience working for the Apples of the world or the Microsofts of the world, and they've now come back home. And so that, I think, is the largest difference today as compared to 10 years ago. The talent, and not just within us, Silicon Valley, but across the globe, that talent just has a lot more understanding of best practices and how to actually grow a business from 0 to 1, and then from 1 to 100, sort of.
And just to bring it to you, Amanda, because I know that I think you're based out of Sydney, right? So I don't know if your perspective is similar, but kind of bringing taking elements of Atin's answer there. What do you think are the main reasons why people are coming back to the likes of China and India, and where are they coming from? Have they been in Silicon Valley and are they leaving to come back? Is it similar in Australia as well?
So I'm a new arrival in Australia myself, but you do have that, right? So you do have, I think there is just more cross-fertilization, right? So talent, can move across borders more easily. There are more of these kind of high growth tech companies. And so you do get that kind of, as Atin says, that kind of crossover, or that, it's almost like a second generation or third generation already, where people who've, Uber already had people who were working with Apple and stuff like that. And then suddenly you've now got the kind of, and this best practice just keeps improving and new ideas. And, you just have much more confidence, quite frankly. If you've already seen it happen yourself as an employee within a startup, you have a lot more confidence to do it yourself, to try it. So I think there's definitely an element of that kind of globalization, I suppose. I would also say, just thinking about kind of how it's changed a little bit, I think the whole startup culture is just so much more vibrant around the world. So, as I said, nobody knew what a startup was when I first worked in one, right? And now Shark Tank is on, there's a Shark Tank pretty much in every country, right? And so it's become, Silicon Valley, the television show, all of this stuff is very much kind of in people's consciousness. So I think there's, again, that general kind of, that cultural awareness, I guess, of startup culture, and makes it a lot easier, makes people more willing to jump into it, has brought new angels into the market. Whereas before, again, your kind of 10 years ago, Silicon Valley, it was your very big mega investment houses, your huge big name VC funds really making the calls as to which tech, who was going to survive and who was not.
Sorry.
Yeah. And now you're really kind of moving into a world where you've got a much wider array of investors coming from very different spaces. So from industry with no technology or startup experience, but coming from industry and saying, we need new solutions here. So they're bringing different experiences into the investment market. So I think there's a lot that has changed recently. And it's one of the things that we try to do at Next Chapter is bust some of these myths. Not everybody is an Uber. Not everybody is a massive unicorn. So if we think more broadly about startups globally, there's a lot happening. Some of them are going to be high growth. Some of them are going to be steady growth, but a little bit slower. And there's a lot more than just those kind of Silicon Valley big names. And
so just touching on that then, what, I think you mentioned it gives you much more confidence to start a company once you've seen it happen yourself, which I guess is somewhat ironic in the sense that the startup world and founders are deemed to be people who are leaders, who are trailblazers, who are doing something different and taking a risk. It's funny that they might have to see someone else doing it in their own country before believing it's possible. So do you think that, obviously Spotify recently we've seen being the first European company to pass a 50 billion valuation. There's lots of benefits that brings to the Stockholm ecosystem. Do you think there has to be a company exit like that, or at least one large company that people can look at before an ecosystem starts to be able to really pick up momentum?
So role models are huge. So again, we're focusing on female founders. Role models for female founders are so important. Course, you're just not seeing women when you go into an investor meeting, you're not seeing women there. You're not hearing great stories. That's why we're so excited about Canva's recent raise. So Australia, one of Australia's superstars, is a female co-founder. She's phenomenal. And, so it's wonderful to see a mixed gender team doing so well. And again, it's just, if you can't see it, you don't know it's a possibility. It's just one of those things, right? So I do think that is definitely an element.
Okay. And so just kind of digging into, I guess, just digging into the detail really. I spoke to an investor in Silicon Valley recently, and the subject of it was actually a sort of similar event to this, and the subject was Silicon Valley is no longer a location, it's a mindset. So, to what extent would you agree with that when you think about, disparate ecosystems who just don't have that virtuous cycle that we're talking about? Is that something that's really easy to sit on a Silicon Valley pedestal and say it's a mindset? You can start a company from wherever. Do you want to give me some opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, you can't beat that. The fact that everybody there in Silicon Valley is thinking that way. They're all willing to take risks. They've all seen it happen. They have a neighbor who did this, that kind of positivity around you makes it all so much easier. So without that, it's a little bit harder, but I think there are other things that other ecosystems have and bring to the table that can be just as important. And I think we're seeing with all of this wonderful digital post-COVID world, we're all reaching out into different ecosystems, connecting across borders. And I think for me, one of the biggest things is more humanity. So one of the things I think about Silicon Valley, it's these big bombastic pitches and yes, no, very quickly. It's a little more nuanced now in this new world 4 months in. There's more humanity, there's more interaction actually. I talked to a friend of mine who's a VC investor here in Sydney, and he was having a very difficult conversation with one of his investees, and his 6-year-old wandered in with a piece of birthday cake, and so suddenly that breaks down barriers in a way that probably has never happened between that, that relationship between investor and investee. So I'm, hopeful that this kind of increased humanity, increased connectivity and also increased authenticity is maybe bringing some of that Silicon Valley magic with the rest of the ecosystem, and we'll see, hopefully. But I don't think it's going to just be one location. There's too much going on all around the world, and markets are different. You can't have everything growing out of Silicon Valley.
So if you, and maybe just taking this back to you, Atin, you invest around the world. Is it genuinely going to change, fundamentally change how you invest, that you can, I guess, remotely do due diligence remotely? You can have your initial meetings, your partner meetings, you can do it over Zoom, right? So how does anything, you don't need to travel anywhere. What's your view on that?
I have I would assume is a contrarian view on this, Alex. I think a lot of investors have for a very long time said that we won't invest in anybody who's not in the same city as us. And to me, that's always sounded like a cop-out, to be honest. It's an excuse. Let's just be very, very clear. Video conferencing and Zoom and all of these things have been pretty good for a fair number of years now. I've been an investor for 5, and I think apart from the first year, which is when I actually had companies that I had invested in around me, in the last 4 years, all of the company investments that I've made, none of them are in the same city as me. In fact, let alone being in the same city, none of them are in the same country as me.
Have you met them face to face? Presumably,
I have actually made investments without meeting founders face to face, without meeting them face to face. Yes, it does mean that I do 4 calls instead of maybe 2 in-person meetings.
And does the process take longer?
The process takes longer, yes. I do 4 calls because I need more time to actually get to know them, get a feel for them. At least for me, the process is I would speak to the founder, then I'll speak to their exec team. So I'll speak to the head of sales, the head of marketing, just to get an understanding of whether the exec team as a whole is, has the same vision. And then the one other thing that I do, which I think is definitely a replacement for a physical activity. So if I was in the same place as the founder, I'd probably take them out for dinner. So I do a similar thing on Zoom where I say, for the next 90 minutes, we won't talk about work. So don't tell me about work. Don't tell me about your team. Tell me about your family, about your upbringing. Why are you doing what you're doing? So I do those things, and that helps me build that relationship, because at the end of the day, really the crux of this whole I want to meet in person is because you think that it'll give you a better relationship. I think having more time, being, empathetic to the other person is much more important than actually being physically in the same location. And I mean, I don't know, 'cause, I mean, that's what I think. And I know that a lot of people don't agree with it. I think there are ways that you replace certain aspects of the interaction. I do a lot more due diligence. I do a lot more reference calls. I'll call my friends in those locations and I'll ask them if they've heard of the founders. Like, I'll do all of that, yes. But I've never felt this need or urgency to be in the same city as the other investee. I've just, in the last 4 years, I've invested in more than 35 companies now, and none of them have been in the same city as me. None.
Interesting. I love that.
Yeah.
Amanda.
I think it's, I mean, I think it's brilliant. I think that's great. And it means that as an investor, you're placing more trust in the founders, in the company, to actually know the market they're working in, to understand all of that. And I think that's a bit of a shift. We talked about that earlier, amongst the three of us. There's this shift. There is more capital in the venture world now. There is more capital out there for startups in many different forms. And one of the things that's coming out of it is that investors don't have all the chips. They don't get to make all of the rules, make all of the decisions as to what works, what doesn't. It's this market, it's that market. Now, exactly as Atin's saying, he has to trust that these, his investees in other markets, they know their customer, they know that market better than he's ever going to be able to. And I think that, again, that trust is so important, and it is a big shift and change in the world of investing at the moment.
I'll add one more thing to this, Alex, which is one of the things that Amanda had said earlier, which is about investing in founders that are not properly represented in the startup ecosystem generally, whether that's women or people from underrepresented minorities and ethnic minorities. I actually think the fact that I've invested virtually almost all the time means that I've actually been able to meet founders that I wouldn't if I was restricting myself to that.
It opens your market hugely. Yeah, and
it's not just that it's geographically flexible, but it's also flexible because all of these founders have different needs and different restrictions.
Yeah,
I invested my first investment out of the new fund. I raised this fund only last year. My first investment out of that fund was in a Black and Latino mixed race woman in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, of all places. I've never been to Milwaukee. I've never been to the state of Wisconsin. I wouldn't even know how to get there. Like, when I travel to the US, I usually go to New York, LA, SF, and then I fly back. Yeah. Even if I was trying to, tell myself, no, I have to meet the founder, there's no way I would have met her before investing. And so I was able to make that investment. And by the way, she is the best performing portfolio for me today. Her valuations are the multiple in terms of increase in valuations, the highest across my portfolio.
Wow.
It's amazing that I was able to actually get that result. And it was only and only because we didn't have any restrictions on being in the same city or in the same country.
Yeah, we definitely see that sort of grind as well, because we are, we have presence in 120 countries. So we have people like Jens running our local ecosystems in, Eritrea, and, we have one in the Gaza Strip and all over. And you meet these incredible people who you would just never be able to interact with, from London or when I'm in Scotland or whatever. So I think it's a really interesting ecosystem shift or sort of environmental shift. And we'll come on to the kind of, what that means for startup founders a little bit later on. But just to sort of focus in on, being geographically located in APAC, and we can pick sort of key ecosystems to focus on. What are the main strengths of actually being, say, look, we can start with Hong Kong. I think Jens runs the chapter there, so let's start there. What are some of the key strengths that people can take advantage of on a global scale of being located in Hong Kong? Maybe Amanda, do you have a view on that?
So, I think Hong Kong has a couple of things going for it. If you're, one of the things is you are, I don't know if it's like 2 or 3 times removed from a millionaire. Pretty much everybody in Hong Kong is 2 or 3 times removed from a millionaire. So when you're looking for kind of seed money, angel money, Hong Kong is a pretty good place to be, because it's not going to be necessarily going to a startup event and a pitch night, though those are plentiful in Hong Kong. it's, you know, possibly talking to somebody in a yoga class, or the person you sit next to at work whose mother or grandfather or whoever else might be interested at the moment in looking for a small investment. And you just never know. You know, so it's a different type of network than Silicon Valley. But the Hong Kong network is pretty effective in terms of getting access to that kind of very early angel capital. So that's one thing it's got going for it. Another thing that I think Hong Kong has going for it is it's this little microcosm of a place. It's a small market, but it's actually quite diverse in a lot of different ways. You've got loads of expats from different places. You've got very different levels of income. You've got to some different markets. And as a result, it can be quite a good kind of pilot location. But for a Hong Kong startup, you need to have that plan as to what's my next market and how am I going to prove myself into that next market immediately, because it is too small to kind of stay there. And I think some companies do get a bit, you end up having to spend more and more time proving yourself, because it is a slightly, you know, slower market in that sense. Mm-hmm. But there's definitely some interesting things, and there's a fantastic ecosystem in terms of the support and people around you, and people are very supportive within the Hong Kong ecosystem because it is relatively small.
Yeah.
Atin, I'd love to hear your view as well.
Yeah, no, the funny thing is I keep going back to like 7 years ago when I first came to Hong Kong, and you know, the ecosystem was even smaller than what it is today, if you can imagine that. The joke that I like to make is that when I came here, there used to be one physical event every 2 weeks. That was the volume of interaction among the community. And before COVID, obviously now that's irrelevant, but before the virus hit us, we were probably having 2 events a night. Like that was the explosion in the ecosystem, at least, exactly. That was the explosion in the ecosystem. So I've seen Hong Kong, you know, go through that entire process. In my mind, what Amanda said is absolutely correct, that this is, it's relatively easier to raise angel early seed capital in Hong Kong than in most other places in Asia. I think the other thing that Hong Kong has going for it is a proximity to this huge market. And yes, Hong Kong in itself is pretty small. I mean, it's only 7 million people. Really, how much revenue can you generate from that? But you've got access to China right next door, huge market. You've got access to Southeast Asia prominently. I mean, it is close enough. It's within maybe a 4 or 5 hour flight for most places, which means that if you did want to actually get access to large corporate customers, they will either have their offices here in Hong Kong or in Singapore or in Kuala Lumpur. And all 3 of those places are within like 4 or 5 hours. So it is actually a great place to be if you're if you're open-minded enough to actually say, let's try and build an international company. Mm-hmm. If you sort of restrict yourself to the boundary of Hong Kong, you're making a huge mistake. And that's where I think some of the companies that have not succeeded, that we certainly would have pegged to have been, you know, successful outcomes, have not been so, is because they sort of restricted themselves to Hong Kong and couldn't really expand beyond the borders. But if they were open to it, and that's sort of my advice to any entrepreneur in Hong Kong, is to be open to the idea of actually needing to expand beyond the borders. That's your best chance of survival and also success.
Great. And, you know, obviously we talked a bit about, you know, arguably location doesn't matter anywhere near as much as it used to. But again, you could also argue it's still optimal to be at least in or near what is a key ecosystem or a connected ecosystem for a variety of different reasons. What would you say are sort of maybe the top, other than Hong Kong, you know, the top ecosystems to think about being based in or to be based in across Asia Pacific?
I'd say it has to be. I'm so sorry, man, if I'm cutting in.
Go.
Just my mind's blurring and it's in a flow.
Go.
I'd say it's Hong Kong, Singapore for sure. If you want to get access to investors and customers within the APAC region. If you're looking at China, then obviously it'd have to be something like a Beijing or a Shanghai. If you were looking at India as a market, it'd be Mumbai. And And then if you're looking at Australia and New Zealand, then of course where Amanda is, which is Sydney. But I think one of the things, I'm sorry, this is a little tangential to what you were saying, but it is related to what Alex was saying earlier. But one of the things that Alex, you were saying was that even though location is irrelevant, it is still relevant because of the fact that you want those connections. And that is so true today. And it's been proven out by a lot of the companies today, because you've got all of these teams that are distributed, and yet they're distributed in the sense that the tech team is, let's say, in Taiwan. I've got a portfolio company. Their tech team is in Taiwan, but their sales team is in Hong Kong. The founder's based in Singapore. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to optimize for cost. You're trying to optimize for quality of talent. So technical teams in Taiwan are amazing. It's the same when if you're in the US, like I know a lot of companies that have their technical teams up north in Canada, because the quality of the talent is amazing and you're able to optimize on cost. And so I think what you said is absolutely correct, that even though location is becoming irrelevant, but you still want to find those connections to the networks. And so I've seen this happen a lot, where the founders will base themselves in the Valley or in New York, or the founders will be in Hong Kong and the team is, somewhere else altogether. And that's becoming more of a trend these days. And I think that's that's a good thing to do. It's a smart thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come to you in a second, Amanda. I was just going to say on that point. So I used to work at Freshworks, which is a golden SaaS company in India, and they're based out of Chennai, and that was definitely one of the key parts of their model. They built a huge amount of their business out of Chennai, and then just had small kind of satellite teams around the world sort of doing the in-person field sales operation, and it lowered the cost so much and enabled a lot of competition with the likes of Zendesk and so on. So it was brilliant to see that model 6-7 years ago kicking off from Chennai, and it's worked. So great to see. Amanda, love to hear your opinion on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Singapore, obviously, as Atin says, it is where definitely you're getting some of the biggest valuations in the region coming out of Singapore. The government, their approach to supporting startups, a lot of it has been to actually direct fund or directly support VC companies. So as a result, there's some fantastic investment happening in Singapore. And it's a pretty favorable regulatory environment and things like that. Usually okay to bring people in pretty easily. Shenzhen is, I think, super exciting in terms of some of the tech coming out of there right now. The maker spaces and things like that. There's some really cool stuff happening there. A little harder to break into, but some interesting things, I think, coming out of there, and we'll continue to see stuff out of there. And then I'm really excited about some of the smaller markets, so the Southeast Asia markets kind of coming up. There are, as Atin says, you can work from anywhere now, right? So, Thailand is investing big in terms of letting anybody come in as a founder visa. So you can come and live in Thailand for a year, very low cost of living. And so they're really pushing to try and get startups to come and be based in Bangkok. So I think we're going to see more and more of these kind of different smaller Asian markets, because they, again, are willing to immediately expand and look at other markets as well.
Great. And just because I know we're moving to Q&A in a couple of minutes, and we've been talking about growing internationally and hiring teams that are based elsewhere in the world. How do you advise portfolio companies that you work with, or even people that you mentor or coach, to set up hiring processes and management processes for teams that will be based, elsewhere in the world? What's the best way to open yourselves up to that and sort of market yourself as a company that wants to hire people from elsewhere? I don't mind which of you takes it first, because
I think you have to have a good reason for it, right? So it really depends. Is it, as you mentioned with Freshworks, is it the idea of recognizing that all of your markets are, have their local nuances and you need local teams in each market? Or is it much more about kind of quality of life for your employees? And, do you want to enable them to live where they're comfortable and just get the most out of them? And I think that latter reason is something that we're seeing a lot with some of the kind of newer startups. So a company that we've done some work with, we've got one founder in Singapore, one in the Valley. than employees in Fiji, Brazil, New Zealand, all over the place.
Amazing.
So that the time zones don't work at all. But they make it work because they all are kind of, living their best life, right? They're all happy where they are. And they have a mission, they have a purpose, they know what they're doing. Everybody has kind of very specific responsibilities, and they're all accountable. And there are plenty of tools to make all of that stuff work. And, I'm a big believer in, as long as you have a common purpose and everybody knows which way they're rowing and how quickly and in time and all of that, you're good to go.
And there's a huge amount of benefits to actually asynchronous communication as well. If you can do it right, technically people can focus more on getting into deep work, work for 6 hours without being interrupted, and you get more done.
No constant ping.
Atin, your view on that quickly, and then we'll jump into Q&A. Hiring internationally and managing teams internationally.
Yeah, so I was actually going to say that there are two things that I've learned work best when you're trying to build a remote team, or at least a team that is distributed internationally. You sort of stole the second point, which is the fact that asynchronous communication is extremely important. I know even within my own company right now with the fund, we've got 5 interns. One's in New York, one's in Milan, one is in London, one is in New Delhi, and then one's in Hong Kong, which is ridiculous to think about because that's an amazing range of time zones. We're on Slack and we're on Notion. And so far we've been working together for about 7 weeks now, and it's been amazing. Just the productivity and the work that we've churned out is brilliant. And I could not imagine how we could have ever done anything better. And that's all predicated on that asynchronous piece. So that's one. The second feedback that I was going to get, or the second tip that I was going to share, is something that I've seen work a lot with some of my portfolio companies. And it actually originates from Automatic. I don't know how many of you guys know Automatic, but it's the company behind WordPress. And they've created this process, which is the contract to hire. So what that means is that they'll give you a small project that you can do in the evenings and on the weekends as you're still working on your own, whatever other full-time job you have. And they set very specific deliverables and expectations from you. And at the end of and usually it's like a 2 or 3 week project where you work on it in the evenings and weekends. At the end of the 3 weeks, you deliver your project. And on the basis of that, they can then sort of understand, what your skill level is, but also what your culture fit is. Were you able to work in an asynchronous, self-directed manner or not? And those things are really important when you're building a team that is, not in the same physical space. So that's been my recommendation to most portfolio companies is look at a contract to hire and then build the asynchronous processes as best as you can.
Yeah. And it's funny, we were speaking to Dylan Field, founder of Figma, last week, who raised, I think, something like 180 million from basically all the top Silicon Valley VCs you could even name. And he was saying the majority of his tech team is based in Nigeria, and it actually happened by accident. He said he put out a job spec, and then someone applied from Nigeria randomly, and he said, I'll give them the same test that I would give anyone else. And they did the same thing over a weekend. He said, build something and I'll do a sort of review on Monday. And he said it was absolutely brilliant. And then they've continued to hire in Nigeria and built a management process around it that works. And he has daily calls with them, 15 minutes. They check in, see how things are going, and it works. So it's great to see this different model picking up. Thanks, guys. So I think, Jens, if I'm right, we're moving into Q&A, right, for the last sort of next 10 minutes or so?
Correct. Thank you, Amanda, Atin, Alex, for a great fireside chat. So we have a number of questions coming into the